You're watching Northern Crimes.
The early 1970s were a time of change and rebellion, particularly on the west coast of the United States. California was a land of opportunity, freedom, and exploration. Hitchhiking had become a symbol of this era, a way for people, especially young adults, to travel cheaply while meeting new faces. But for some, those carefree journeys turned into a nightmare. In Sonoma County, an idyllic area north of San Francisco, this lifestyle would be forever shadowed by fear. Between 1972 and 1979, a series of chilling murders shattered the peace of this region. Young women, most of them hitchhikers, vanished without a trace. Their bodies would later be found discarded in remote areas, carelessly abandoned along steep embankments, hidden in creeks, or buried in shallow graves. To this day, the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders remain one of California's most haunting mysteries. Was it the work of just one killer? Or did a series of predators converge on the region, taking advantage of vulnerable young girls and women? This is the true story of the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker mystery, a tale of unspeakable tragedy, unanswered questions, and a community left forever changed. This is Northern Crimes. The Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders stand out as one of the most perplexing unsolved cases in California's history. Starting between 1972 and 1973, Santa Rosa became the backdrop for a disturbing sequence of crimes. What began as isolated reports of missing young women evolved into a grim realization that a predator was stalking the area. The victims shared a troubling pattern. They were vulnerable young women who vanished while hitchhiking. Their bodies were discovered in remote, wooded locations, often in advanced stages of decomposition, leaving investigators with little forensic evidence. The seemingly targeted nature of the killings, combined with the remote locations where the bodies were found, indicated that the perpetrator was familiar with the area, methodical in his approach. The timeline of these crimes, combined with their specific geography, created a puzzle for law enforcement. The methods of killing varied, and investigators struggled to determine whether they were looking for one or more assailants. Leads were followed, suspects were questioned, and theories emerged, but no definitive answers were found. Over time, the cases grew colder. Lingering questions haunted detectives. A cloud of fear hung over local residents. Yet, the story has endured, not just for its brutality, but for the sense of mystery that surrounds it. Decades later, the story continues to captivate investigators, armchair detectives, and true crime enthusiasts. Each new lead sparks hope for resolution. So, this isn't just a story of crime. It's a reflection of a moment in history, a time when life in America was a little more carefree, an era where danger lurked unseen. What lies ahead is an exploration of the lives lost, the search for justice, and the many unanswered questions that linger over the hills of Sonoma County. Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber were just beginning their teenage years, navigating the tumultuous transition from childhood to adolescence. Maureen, 12 years old, was described as outgoing and vibrant, with a magnetic personality. She loved music and had recently developed a passion for skating at the local ice rink. 13-year-old Yvonne was quieter than Maureen, often preferring to listen and laugh along rather than take the spotlight. She was artistic, with a knack for sketching and a love for reading adventure novels. Together, the two girls were inseparable, two halves of a whole. On February 4th, 1972, the friends left the Redwood Empire Ice Arena, telling a friend they were going to meet someone who promised them marijuana. That was the last time they were seen alive. Months later, their skeletal remains were discovered on a steep embankment off Franz Valley Road. "19-year-old Kim Allen had dreams that stretched far beyond the small town of Larkspur, where she worked at a natural food store. She was a free spirit who loved art and literature, and she was known for her kindness and willingness to help others. Friends described her as fiercely independent, with a sharp wit and a sense of adventure. On March 4th, 1972, Kim left work and hitched a ride towards Santa Rosa Junior College, where she was a student, but she never arrived. The next day, her body was found discarded at the bottom of an embankment on Enterprise Road. She'd been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled with a wire. At just 13 years old, Lori Lee Cursa was a girl on the edge of childhood and adolescence, caught between the need for independence and the vulnerability of youth. She had a rebellious streak. Her friends described her as bold and adventurous. Although she was known to run away from home occasionally, she always returned after a few days. Then, in November 1972, Lori disappeared for good. Witnesses reported seeing her with a white man with a, quote, Afro-style haircut, driving a van. Her body was discovered weeks later near Calistoga Road, just a short distance from her family's home. Her neck was broken, likely from falling or being pushed from a moving vehicle. Carolyn Davis, 15, was the kind of girl who could light up a room with her smile. Despite growing up in a troubled home, she remained optimistic and full of dreams. Family members described her as fiercely loyal and protective, especially of her younger siblings. She often spoke of becoming a nurse one day, a dream inspired by her deep compassion for others. On July 15, 1973, Carolyn was last seen hitchhiking near Garberville. Reportedly, she was running away from home, fearful after witnessing a violent crime. 2 weeks later, her body was found in a shallow grave near the same site where Maureen and Yvonne had been discovered. Caroline had been poisoned with strychnine, a cruel and calculated act that left her family shattered. Teresa Walsh was a 23-year-old woman with a kind heart and a sense of determination. Originally from Malibu, she'd recently been working at Zuma Beach to save money for her future. Friends and family described her as dependable and loving, someone who always put others before herself. On December 22, 1973, Teresa was hitchhiking home to Garberville for Christmas when she vanished. 6 days later, her body was discovered in Mark West Creek near Santa Rosa. She'd been hogtied in a particularly sadistic manner. A nylon rope looped from her ankles to her neck, forcing her body into a painful position that led to slow asphyxiation. Her death was among the most brutal of the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders, leaving investigators haunted by the killer's cruelty. The Sonoma County Jane Doe remains a mystery, a nameless victim whose story is only known through the skeletal remains discovered in Rincon Valley in 1979. Forensic experts determined that she was likely in her late teens or early 20s, standing about 5'3" tall, with reddish-brown hair. Her body had been bound with Venetian blind cord, and evidence suggested she had been carried in a duffel bag before being discarded in a shallow grave. Despite exhaustive efforts to identify her, Jane Doe's name and her story remain unknown. She represents countless unnamed victims of violent crime whose identities are lost but whose tragedies demand justice. Jeanette Kamahaley was a bright and ambitious 20-year-old student at Santa Rosa Junior College. Born in Hawaii, she was warm and kind, endearing to her friends and classmates alike. She graduated from Yokohama American High School in Japan in 1970, a testament to her unique upbringing and adaptability. She was described as a conscientious student, someone who took her education seriously and was always willing to help others. On April 25, 1972, Jeanette was last seen hitchhiking near the Katati on-ramp of Highway 101, a common practice for young people at that time. A friend witnessed her likely abduction, recalling that she entered a faded brown Chevrolet pickup truck outfitted with a homemade wooden camper. The driver was described as a 20 to 30-year-old Caucasian man with an Afro-style haircut. That was the last time anyone saw Jeanette. Despite exhaustive efforts by law enforcement and her family, her body has never been found. Carrie Graham, 15, and Francine Trimble, 14, were best friends who did everything together. Carrie was known for her fiery personality and rebellious spirit, often challenging authority but fiercely protective of her loved ones. Francine, quieter and more reserved, was the grounding force in their friendship. She came from a troubled home and often found solace in Carrie's company. In December 1978, the girls planned a trip to Coddington Mall in Santa Rosa, but they never made it. Their remains were discovered in July 1979 near Willits, about 80 miles away, but it wasn't until 2016 that DNA testing confirmed their identities. The delay in identifying the two girls added another layer of tragedy to their story, leaving their families to grapple with decades of unanswered grief. The investigation into the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders has spanned decades and included a range of suspects and theories. In the 1970s, forensic technology was still in its infancy. DNA testing, digital databases, and modern profiling tools were unavailable. Investigators had to rely on physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and hunches, many of which led to dead ends. Complicating matters further was the transient nature of hitchhiking. The victims had no predictable routes or destinations, making it difficult to trace their movements or pinpoint the killer's patterns. When the murders in Santa Rosa first came to light, the infamous Zodiac Killer was still a looming specter over Northern California. Active from 1968 to 1969, the Zodiac had claimed responsibility for at least 5 confirmed murders. He sent cryptic letters to newspapers until 1974, in which he boasted of killing up to 37 people. His victims were mostly young couples in secluded locations, but he also attacked a lone taxi driver in San Francisco. The connections to the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders lay not only in geography, but also in the elusive, sadistic nature of the crimes. In fact, the Zodiac had once written that he planned to vary his methods of killing to confuse authorities. Additionally, the similarities between the Santa Rosa victims and some of the Zodiac's alleged victims, such as Donna Lass and Kathleen Johns, added weight to this theory. Sonoma County Sheriff Don Stripeke once publicly speculated that the Zodiac could have evolved into the Santa Rosa Killer, citing the symbolism and escalating violence at some of the Santa Rosa crime scenes. However, other law enforcement officials, including those with detailed knowledge of the Zodiac's pattern, dismissed this idea. They argued that the Zodiac's crimes rarely involved sexual violence, a hallmark of the Santa Rosa killings. Despite this, the Zodiac's shadow remains over the case, fueling speculation to this day. One of the most chilling names linked to the Santa Rosa murders is Ted Bundy. Known for his charisma and calculated brutality, Bundy was active in Washington, Oregon, and Utah during the early 1970s, making him a plausible suspect. His victims, like the Santa Rosa hitchhikers, were often young women with long hair parted in the middle, a detail investigators couldn't ignore. Bundy's timeline intersected with the murders, and he had connections to California, including attending Stanford University and working on a political campaign in the early 1970s. Witness descriptions of a man seen with one victim eerily matched Bundy's appearance at the time, a white man with a large, quote, Afro-style haircut driving a truck. However, investigators struggled to place Bundy in California at the exact time of the murders. Credit card receipts and other records placed him in Washington around some of the crime dates. Despite this, Bundy himself hinted at unconfessed crimes in California before his execution in 1989, leaving the question of his involvement tantalizingly unanswered. Arthur Lee Allen, a longtime suspect in the Zodiac case, has also been scrutinized in connection with the Santa Rosa murders. Living in Santa Rosa during the early 1970s, Allen was known for his troubling behavior, including some troubling run-ins with the law. Authorities noted that Allen had intimate knowledge of the remote areas where the victims were found and that his timeline aligned with the Santa Rosa killings. Allen's arrest in 1974 for coincided with the abrupt end of the Santa Rosa murders, leading some to speculate he might have been responsible. Despite these suspicious overlaps, there was never enough physical evidence to connect Allen to the murders. Investigators repeatedly cleared him of being the Zodiac, and by extension, many believe he was not involved in the Santa Rosa crimes either. His reputation, however, ensures his name remains a point of discussion. The story of Jim Mordecai, an agriculture teacher in Santa Rosa, gained attention following the release of the documentary The Truth About Jim. Mordecai was a violent and abusive man whose family revealed harrowing accounts of domestic and sexual violence. Mordecai's proximity to the crimes, combined with his pattern of sadistic behavior, made him a compelling suspect. Family members recalled him making chilling statements about, quote, hog-tying and slitting throats, echoing the way some Santa Rosa victims were found. Witnesses from the era claimed a man resembling Mordecai was seen with one of the victims, further fueling speculation. Yet Mordecai's alibis, including documented public appearances and his 1973 wedding day aligning with one victim's disappearance, cast doubt on his involvement. Despite the circumstantial evidence, no forensic links were ever established between him and the murders, leaving his role uncertain but haunting. Joseph Naso, the so-called alphabet killer, was convicted of murdering multiple women in California between 1977 and 1994. Naso's victims, like the Santa Rosa Hitchhikers, were young women whose bodies were discarded in remote locations. When authorities searched Naso's home in 2011, they discovered a diary detailing his violent fantasies and a list of victims, some of whom remain unidentified. While his known murders occurred years after the Santa Rosa spree, investigators haven't ruled him out as a suspect, particularly given the similar disposal methods and his chilling record of violence. Jack Boken, a convicted serial rapist and murderer, has emerged as a possible suspect after recent breakthroughs in cold case investigations. Boken was linked through DNA evidence to the 1996 murder of Michelle Marie Veal in Sonoma County. Her nude body was dumped in a manner reminiscent of the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker killings. Known for his extreme violence, intelligence, and cunning, Boken was notorious for brutalizing his victims, sometimes holding them captive in basements while his family members remained unaware. Investigators have confirmed that Boken was present in the Sonoma County area during the early 1970s, placing him in proximity to the Hitchhiker murders. While no definitive link has been established, his history of targeting vulnerable women and the circumstances of Veal's murder have reignited suspicions about his involvement in other cold cases from the area. California in the 1970s was a grim landscape of serial killers, and several others have been suggested as possible culprits. Roger Reese Kibbe, the I-5 Strangler, and Philip Hughes Jr., a convicted killer of young women in Northern California, are among them. Both men's known crimes share unsettling similarities with the Santa Rosa killings, including targeting young women and dumping their bodies in isolated areas. Hughes, active in the 1970s, brutally stabbed his victims and disposed of their bodies along public roads, while Kibbe strangled women and abandoned their remains near highways. Though neither has been definitively tied to Santa Rosa, their crimes fit the disturbing pattern seen in the Hitchhiker killings. Some investigators and researchers argue that the Santa Rosa Killer, or killers, was likely a local predator familiar with the secluded rural areas of Sonoma County. The geographic clustering of the bodies suggests an intimate knowledge of the area's terrain, something less likely for an itinerant serial killer. This theory points to someone who blended seamlessly into the community, a postal worker, utility worker, or teacher, someone who could navigate the area unnoticed and target vulnerable hitchhikers with ease. This invisible killer theory underscores the tragic reality that such criminals often hide in plain sight, making them even harder to identify. In recent years, the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders have resurfaced in public consciousness, propelled by advances in forensic science and the proliferation of true crime media. Modern DNA technology, particularly genetic genealogy, has given investigators new tools to revisit cold cases. Inspired by successes like the identification of the Golden State Killer, authorities have re-examined evidence from the Santa Rosa cases, hoping that updated testing might yield fresh leads. While no significant breakthrough has been announced yet, the potential for new discoveries, it keeps hope alive. True crime podcasts and documentaries have played a significant role in bringing renewed attention to these cases. Programs like the Morbid Podcast and HBO Max's The Truth About Jim have explored the complexities of these murders, combining thorough research with expert interviews. And online communities and amateur sleuths have also become deeply engaged with this case. Platforms like Reddit and dedicated true crime forums host extensive discussions where enthusiasts analyze old reports, share theories, and sometimes uncover overlooked details. In fact, maybe one of you watching this video might get involved. While these efforts haven't solved the case, they keep the victims' stories alive and maintain public interest, which can be crucial for uncovering new information. Despite all this new attention, the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker killings remain unsolved. Law enforcement continues to encourage anyone with information, no matter how minor it may seem, to come forward. As technology progresses and public interest continues on, there remains a glimmer of hope that one day the victims and their families will find the closure they deserve. The Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders remain one of California's darkest mysteries. Decades later, the case leaves us with lingering questions. Were these heinous crimes the work of a single predator or a series of opportunistic killers? Could the advancements of today finally bring justice to the victims and closure to their families? For now, the story of the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker mystery stands out as a chilling reminder of a time when freedom came at a dangerous cost. In a world full of open roads, some paths lead to darkness, and some stories remain forever untold.